So literally exercising your body is maintaining your brain health.
Hey everyone, welcome to Evolving Ageless. This is the Enlightened Woman's Antidote to Aging. I'm Michelle Dreilich, and I am on a mission to change the way women age. You've heard it before, but this is what I do. And so each week I'm joined by medical experts, beauty, environmental, everyone that's on their own mission. And together, we're going to bring you the latest and greatest research and findings and experiences to help you live ageless. And so I have to tell you something. I am super excited. I know I say this all the time, but my guest today is one of my not just favorite physicians, one of my favorite people of all time. And I want to introduce you to Dr. Kristine Burke. Hi, Dr. Burke.
Hi, how are you, Michelle?
I'm doing great. I am so glad that you could join us today. I'm beyond glad. Like, this woman is a ninja, and I'm going to tell you why. So, she has spent most of her career, like, her focus is functional medicine, integrative medicine. She's triple board certified. That's a big deal. She's got 3 board certifications in integrative medicine, family medicine, and sports medicine. She's also certified by the Institute of Functional Medicine in functional medicine. So she works with her patients, and the goal is that all of her patients have happy, healthy, vibrant lives. And so at the first sign of any disease, she's on top of it and working on the root cause and reversing disease. Her expertise runs the gamut. I mean, I could just sit and talk to her day in and day out, and there will never exhaust topics. She is a genius, honestly. And the most exciting thing is she's a part of the Ageless Transformations program. She is one of the faculty members. We knew from the start we needed a ninja like Dr. Burke. So I know that's heavy stuff that I just laid out there, but I just want you to know how amazing she is. And today we're going to talk about how women age. So this one, we're digging right into the heart of the topic. So Dr. Burke, I will say this, I'm just going to mention it right away. Most women think that when they start to see crow's feet or maybe smile lines or marionette lines, that that is a sign of aging. Tell us, lay it on us.
Well, it is true. It's a sign of aging, but it's a late sign of aging. So the process really starts long before we start to see the effects on the outside. And it starts with oxidative stress in the body and damage to our support structures like collagen and elastin in the skin, for example, when we're talking about crow's feet. But that doesn't just happen because time happens. It happens because of inflammation in the body. And so what we need to be thinking about is what are the root causes of that inflammation? Because if we can deal with those, then we dampen the effects and the damage to our skin, to our muscle, to our bone, to all of these things that we see as evidence of the aging process.
Oh my God, that is so powerful. And so inflammation comes in all forms, right? I think most people think of inflammation, they can at least identify with it, like if they sprain an ankle or
Mhm.
something like that, or they cut, get a cut on their finger, we can identify with inflammation that way. But how is that different than the kind of inflammation that you're talking about?
So those are the inflammatory processes that happen around an acute injury, or we're also familiar with the acute illness inflammatory process, like when we have flu-like symptoms, and we won't talk about that other virus right now. But what really we're thinking about when we're talking about the aging process is this chronic underlying inflammation. And it is sourced from imbalances in the physiology, whether that be from dietary sources, the types of foods that we're choosing to eat, or inadequacies in the nutrients and the components that we need from plants in particular that support the process of transformation in the liver, where we're getting rid of toxins and we're dampening the inflammation that's caused by those things. There's so many different avenues of the physiology where we can develop inflammation, and it's not the same as what we see in response to an acute injury or an acute illness. It's usually hidden.
Right, it's hidden. And when
Hmm.
we say, so an acute injury is something that happens in a very short term, like the flu or a sprained ankle or
The
something.
sprained ankle. Hmm.
Right, and when we see something like that, we see, like, it's so visible and we feel it, right? It's painful, it's swollen, maybe it's bruised. We get all of these visible cues and physical cues, right? Like, we can't walk on it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But with inflammation, right? It's it's kind of everywhere, just kind of smoldering throughout all of our blood vessels. Is that where it travels? Is that where we see it?
Well, we'll see it in the blood vessels, but we'll see it in the tissues. We can see it in the brain with cognitive
Mm.
changes or just brain fog, or that early forgetfulness that we often complain about, senior moments, if you will. And those are all symptoms of this chronic inflammatory process that's damaging the communication within our tissues and in our organs. So it is a little bit of a different way of looking at inflammation. It's not so much the swelling component, although it can be. Like, I was looking at a picture of myself from my senior year of high school that a friend posted on Facebook, and I was struck by actually how inflamed I looked at the time without knowing it, because I mean, who knew anything about that back in the 80s? So I certainly didn't. But I didn't know that I had a gluten sensitivity. And so I'm literally in the picture holding like a gluten bun thing that I was eating. And now I look at it and I'm like, oh, there's the connection, the gluten, the inflammation, and my face just looked puffy, even though I weighed
Mhm.
probably like 95 pounds back then.
Right, so that puffiness, right? We don't see
Mm-hmm.
it as swelling, because swelling is a painful thing, but this
Mm-hmm.
overall kind of puffiness. And so if someone has a chronic illness, like let's say someone has autoimmunity or autoimmune conditions or diabetes or cardiovascular disease, anything like that that's chronic, is there a likelihood that there is systemic inflammation? Is that what we're saying?
Absolutely. Systemic inflammation is actually a very important root cause of most, if not all, of the chronic diseases that we deal with. Even things that you wouldn't imagine would be related to inflammation, like osteoporosis or loss of muscle mass, like we've talked about. We're all familiar with the idea that, especially for women, we tend to get frail as we age, and we attribute that to the aging process, to literally the number of our age. But the reality is, it happens because of the damage of inflammation that's been going on chronically in our system, that undercurrent of low grade inflammation. And when it's not low grade, when it's a higher grade of inflammation, that's where we can see things that we would assign to inflammation, like autoimmune disease, for example, particularly the ones where the inflammation is apparent, like inflammatory bowel disease, like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, or rheumatoid arthritis, where we have these swollen, inflamed joints. It's apparent there, so it makes sense. But the same process is happening in all of those other conditions that you mentioned. It's just expressed in different ways.
Wow. So that's heavy stuff, right? Because you mentioned, so if we think about the idea that, and we'll touch on root causes, right? Where this is coming from. But
Mhm.
if we've got this low grade inflammation in our body, so perhaps we don't have a chronic disease. Because we know if we have a chronic disease, you absolutely have systemic inflammation. So everything we're
Right.
about to talk about applies to you. If you don't have a chronic disease, though, that doesn't mean you don't have systemic inflammation. And so signs of this systemic inflammation that you just mentioned is maybe this puffiness, but also some cognitive decline, some brain
Mhm.
fog, foggy thinking. Muscle loss is huge, right?
Huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so it's interesting because when we lose muscle, that kind of kicks off a whole process, right? And we have hormones that change with inflammation. We have muscle that changes with inflammation, and collagen changes, all of that, right? So maybe speak a little bit to that.
Oh my gosh, that's a huge topic in and of itself. As we start to lose muscle, it changes so many different parameters. I mean, first of all, just at face value, with less muscle mass, you have less energy generating capacity or thermal generating capacity. So it's that classic, right? The grandma with the blanket over her lap because she can't keep warm. Well, what else that means is that you're also burning less calories at rest. You have less muscle mass, you're burning fewer calories at rest. It affects your ability to manage your weight and fat metabolism. And then with less muscle mass, we also start to develop what we call insulin resistance, where our cells stop responding to the signal insulin to bring glucose, or the sugar fuel from the carbohydrates that we eat, into the cell to generate energy. So we get that kind of slow loss of energy, right? I'm not like I used to be, or I used to have more energy, or thank goodness, kids are born to us when we're young, because when we get older, we don't have that energy. Well, those aren't factors of the numeric change in our aging. Those are factors of that kind of chronic inflammatory process, where we relate it back to loss of muscle mass and loss of energy generating capacity.
And weight gain. It's
And
all one part of the picture, right?
right, they're all interrelated. It's a very connected system.
Which makes sense then, as a woman reaches menopause, or those menopausal years, whether it's perimenopause before, and when we start to see some symptoms,
Mm-hmm.
and then postmenopausal, because as we lose muscle, as this breakdown starts to happen, our hormones are changing, and we find ourselves tackling weight issues, right? I've always said, when I was working with patients, you know, those women that said, "Oh, once I hit menopause, I gained 15 pounds." And I always was a little skeptical, even though I knew nutritionally, understood the hormone connection. I still was just a little skeptical until it happened to me, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Then it was like, listen, I'm eating right, I'm moving, I'm doing what I need to do, and things are changing inside of my body. So that was kind of a wake up call for me too, that maybe I needed to pay closer attention to what I was doing and get that into line. Um,
Right. Well,
fantastic.
when we have those hormones optimally balanced in our younger years, they can mask what's happening with the loss of muscle mass and some of those other metabolic changes. And then when we lose that support as well, then you really see the effects of having lost that muscle mass over the previous 1 or 2 decades. And it can be super subtle too, because it's not like you see yourself shrinking away. Don't we wish that that was how it happened? But more often we just see the transition of the body, where we have relatively more fat, relatively less muscle, and maybe the body doesn't really look that different. So it's a hidden process that you may not even be aware is happening, or you may think isn't happening to you.
And I think we see that all the time, right? There are so many women that I see that are, maybe 50s, 60s, where they're getting petite, or where they're petite. They've been petite their whole lives, but they start to show signs of just being maybe they look frail, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference between being petite and fit and healthy, and petite and frail. And that crossover happens. And I think what happens is, as women, we're so concerned, myself included. I mean, I fall victim to this too. I think we're so concerned with how our clothes fit and what we look like in them, that weight loss of any kind is managing our weight. And it puts us
Mm-hmm.
in this place where we are losing muscle to maintain our look, without realizing that we're replacing it maybe with some more visceral fat.
Right. Right. Absolutely
Wow.
true. Absolutely true.
Wow.
We pay attention to the outward expression of our body composition, and we're not necessarily paying attention to the inward composition. That's where that whole body composition testing can be super useful, because you can't tell by looking what someone is made of on the inside.
That's right. And that's why the scale is lying to you. The
Absolutely.
scale is filled with misinformation.
It's
It's just
so
telling you a
true.
number. So I love to say it lies. But, and that's because if it makes sense, we can be losing muscle
Mhm.
and increasing our fat, and the the scale stays the same, or we're losing muscle and that we're losing weight,
Right.
right? So, and that is such a concern for women now, right? Because the way I view it is women that are at this fork in the road when they hit the second act of life, right? And when we get there, we're at the top of the hill, and how we make the transition through our lives, the rest of how we live our lives is really right now. This is such a
Mhm.
critical point for women, where if you make the right changes to your lifestyle, you can literally change the trajectory of what the next, 20, 30 years looks like for you.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Case in point, I had a patient in the office yesterday, 78 years old, and she just looks amazing because of all the work that we've done on reversing her root causes, her inputs of inflammation. And she's vibrant and active and just easily looks 10, 15 years younger than her actual age.
Mhm.
It's great.
Yeah. And that's the goal. I mean, for me, that's the goal. We talk about this all the time. I got to this age, I'm at the top of the hill, and I realized it's downhill. Like, there's the way out is downhill. And so for me, it's about extending the top of the hill as long as I can, living
Yes.
at the top of the hill, literally.
Mm-hmm.
And that describes your patient, right? 78 years old, she's living at the top of the hill.
Right.
So there is no over the hill. That
Right.
we can get rid of that. We can eliminate that, right? It's all
Hmm.
about how long we stay at the top of the hill. That's what I think.
Yeah, exactly. That extending that quality of life phase so that it doesn't have that downward decline that we see with the over the hill concept.
Yes, yes. Okay,
Hmm.
so let's shift gears and talk about the root causes. Like, what can we do? What things can we do that improve this, that keep us at the top of the hill, right? So you mentioned things like nutrition and exercise and maybe stress and sleep and things like that.
Hmm.
Let's talk about it, because I think so many women think they're doing the right thing and maybe they're not.
Hmm. Well, and it's difficult too because there's so much information out there and so much misinformation, and everybody wants to tout their dietary intervention so that they can make a buck off of it. And there is no one size fits all. I think that there are definitely, right? There are definitely core tenets of nutrition that apply across the board for most people. But the nuances of what each individual needs that's really where the challenge lies in figuring it out and sorting through that. And that's one of the things that we work with people on. And it's amazing the difference that's with how different people need to eat to fuel their body optimally, and what works amazingly well for this person can just be a disaster for this person. And so how anybody tries to navigate that on their own out there is beyond me, because it's a challenging thing. But that being said, like you and I have talked about before, there are clearly these anti-inflammatory core things that we want to be thinking about. We want to be thinking about lots of variety of color and type of vegetables and fruits as well, but fruits more in moderation because they are a natural sugar. Even though it's balanced by the fiber, it's still a natural sugar. So you can't replace what you need in vegetables by just eating more fruit, because that's not going to work well for the physiology for most people either. So that wide variety, we call it eating the rainbow, choosing something from every different color group as many times as possible during the day. So there's a variety. You can't be the person that just has broccoli on Mondays, peas and carrots on Tuesdays, lather, rinse, repeat, right? That just that doesn't supply what your body needs, because all those colors have different plant nutrients in them, and each of those plant nutrients has a different effect, a different impact within the body, a different thing that it helps us to defend against, whether it's oxidation or inflammation or enzyme function, or it has anti-cancer properties. There's so many different things that these plant or phytonutrients, we call them, can accomplish for us. So that is key. Like literally, when someone says to me, I don't eat vegetables, I don't like them, my immediate thought is, then you can't be healthy. It's not compatible. So that's a big row to hoe down that line, because you really have to help people to understand the importance that the variety of nutrients brings into their physiology.
Wow. Okay, so I love this because when I was working with patients, I would always say, I didn't ask you if you liked vegetables. I asked you if you wanted to get healthy because that's
Yes.
true. I mean, I know we give there it's kind of fun to say, "Oh, it's green," I mean, but as adults, we're way past that. Like it's
Yeah.
the challenge I think is we enjoy food in America. We all do. I'm a foodie. I know you're a foodie.
Yes.
We know how to enjoy quality food. And somehow that, and I said quality on purpose, I think somehow our desire to experience and enjoy food has gone to a whole different level in America. Let's just leave it at that. And so
Mm-hmm.
enjoyment of food now becomes it's all about what it does to your palate, how it stimulates your palate and how it tastes and how it feels and we've gotten away. While you were talking, I completely realized that we forget that we eat actually to nourish our bodies. We eat
Yes.
so we can move, so we can think, so we can live our daily lives, so we can run away from lions, tigers, and bears, so we can deal with
Mm-hmm.
stress, so we can all of those things. That's what food is
Absolutely.
for. And food is so when we sprain our ankle, we can heal. Every
Mm-hmm.
part of that process requires nutrition, right? We forget
Absolutely.
that. We totally
Yes.
forget that.
Well, and I think in part it's because our bodies are designed with an amazing capacity to compensate for all the crap we do to ourselves, that it's super easy to have that disconnect between what you eat and how you feel or how you perform or how you behave or think or any of those, or look for that matter, right? Because that process of chronic inflammation is a decades long process. So
Yes.
you don't necessarily see the effects of the choices that you're making as readily as they are actually damaging you.
It's slow and sneaky.
Mhm.
It's slow and
Yes, I
sneaky, and
like
I
that.
will say this, it's slow and sneaky until you wake up and you're 50, and then you think, "Holy moly, what
Yeah.
happened?" Right? I've and so even for people that are very mindful of nutrition and exercise and stress and sleep and things like that, your body is still always in the process of healing. And so
Mhm.
always. So I think that's a great point. So if you're making choices that are not healthy nutrition wise, and you're right, there is no one size fits all. There isn't one. And there are nothing these days but fad diets everywhere. And not that they
Mhm.
don't work, they do work in many ways. But a
Well,
lot of these
depending on your
diets
definition of work, right?
what right. That's right. That's so good. And I think part of the challenge is we're looking for a short-term answer to a long-term problem.
Yes, the quick
And
fix.
that's just how we are.
Mhm.
Amazon helps us develop that mindset knowing that I can have it here tomorrow or in 2 hours. So it makes it hard to realize that just chipping away day by day of living healthy is the way to go.
Right. Well, I think a really good visual for that is if you think about our tissue turnover. So you were saying healing, but even if you take it one step back from that, not even necessarily healing, just continuing, right? Functioning. So we replace the lining of our intestine about once every 4 days. So all of those cells, all of those cell components, all of the membrane components from our essential fatty acids and our choline and different, food nutrients that we need, everything that's going on inside the cell, all of that has to be remanufactured and replaced. And we replace our skeleton about 4 times in our lifetime. So all of those building blocks are from the food that we eat. And some of it's from recycling, but a lot of it is being replaced from the food that we eat. So if you think about that process of 1 or 2 decades of, Big Macs and French fries versus a rainbow of vegetables and maybe lean meats and choosing organic things so that we don't have this huge load of pesticides coming into our bodies, those types of choices, then you can start to see why it takes such a long time for us to maybe see some of the effects of that, but that it's a critical point. It takes a while to turn it around once you've gotten to that point. Because now you have to replace all of those poorly made components.
That is exactly right. I love it. It's so true. And I think that's why, you were pivotal when we created, I'm just going to take a diversion here. When we created the Ageless Transformations Nutrition Plan, we worked together on this idea that there isn't a one size fits all. And that's why there are 3 different tracks, and how people
Mm-hmm.
find themselves on track 1 and track 3, or track 2 and track 3, or 3 and 1,
Mm-hmm.
because we're all different, and we're all in different stages of healing, and cleaning up ourselves, right? We're all in these
Mm-hmm.
different stages of evolution. And so that's why we created the program, so that it works for everyone, so that no matter
Mm-hmm.
what your goals are, what you need, and true goals, right? Not just fad
Yes.
diet goals. That's so critical. So
Right.
let's talk about movement.
Oh my goodness. So movement, well, I mean, the immediate association, right, is with maintenance of muscle mass. And so we know that that's super important because we've talked about how that has its interplay with our insulin signaling and our metabolic set point and our ability to burn fat and all of those things we talked about earlier. But in addition, exercise is one of the most powerful ways that we have to stimulate the production of a hormone called BDNF, brain derived neurotrophic factor. It's a hormone that we make that stimulates the maintenance of connections and the growth of connections within the brain. So, literally, exercising your body is maintaining your brain health. And then we have the concept of the demand on the muscle also creating a demand for the presence of mitochondria, which are the little power plants inside the cell that create our energy currency called ATP. That's just like we use electricity to keep the lights on. In our body, we use ATP as the currency of energy. And so your ability to produce energy to both do the processes that your cells and tissues and organs need to do, and then also to feel energetic and to feel like you have energy, all of that relies on both the quantity and the quality of the little mitochondria, the little power plants that you have. And exercise is a powerful stimulant of that. So many ways that exercise benefits us as we're looking at trying to maintain that vibrancy of life.
Oh, isn't that crazy? So most people think of, I exercise, I sadly we think of it to maintain the way we look, but to get strong, stay healthy, not many people understand the relationship between movement, exercise, and brain health. And
Yes.
I know that's top of mind for so many people these days, because we're seeing increasing um, this increasing likelihood of cognitive decline in people, right? I
Oh,
know you
yes,
deal
an
with this
explosion.
every day, every day.
Hmm.
Not only are we exercising for the way we look and the way we feel, um,
Hmm.
exercise, to your point about ATP, more exercising creates more energy. And I know that sounds counterintuitive for people, right?
Hmm.
So explain that, because I think that's a big thing that people lose sight of.
Well, and it's interesting because in a healthy functioning physiology, exercise absolutely increases energy because the demand for the energy production you need to perform the exercise tells the body that we need to make more mitochondria so that each cell, let's say, your non-exercising state, maybe you have 150, I'm just making numbers. And once you've been exercising for a while, now you've increased that, maybe you've doubled it to 300. And that's why as you continue to exercise, your ability to do what it is you're doing, you can do more and more and more. It's not just a practice effect, it's literally an effect that has to do with the ability to supply enough power, the battery charge, if you will. So we have that component. And then we also have the concept that if you're exercising and you feel just like depleted afterwards, just that you can't recover, that you don't feel like exercise is bringing you benefit, that's a very important signal that your body is giving you that your mitochondria are compromised. Because if you can't respond to that demand appropriately and increase what you need, maybe you have an excess toxic burden in the body, and that's poisoning the mitochondria and their ability to generate energy or to replicate or what have you. But those are things that are giving you a clue. It's not just, oh, I'm not wired that way. Not at all. We're all wired that way. So it's telling you that something's not right, that you have a chronic inflammatory process that's damaging your ability to the ability of your physiology to respond in this way.
That was key. I don't know if everybody caught that. We're bringing it full circle because we started our conversation talking about inflammation. So if you are exercising and you feel, what Dr. Burke is saying is that could be a sign that systemic inflammation, that chronic underlying inflammation, is preventing your body from your cells from making more energy, from making more mitochondria. What's fascinating, it takes us all the way back to high school biology, but remember, inside of each cell is this little factory that makes energy. And the more you exercise, what I understand you saying, so correct me if I'm wrong,
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
more you exercise, the more not just energy your factory produces, but the more factories you make. You
Mm-hmm.
actually build the cell up more with more and more factories for energy.
Right. It's just like anything else that we see. The demand creates more, right? It's like franchising. You're making more and more of them because there's a big demand for it, and you want to be able to serve that demand. And the other point I would make, Michelle, is that just because you have the capacity to exercise and maybe improve your performance does not mean that you are free of inflammation. It probably means that you've maintained your compensatory ability, right? The things that your body has, or what you're eating, or how you're living your life has allowed you to maintain the ability to compensate for the inflammation, but it doesn't mean the absence of inflammation. I think that's a really important point.
Totally, because eating any kind of food gives you energy. So you can still work out and make it through a workout. That doesn't mean that you're healing from that workout well. It doesn't mean that there's a lack of inflammation. I love that. So yes, if you feel after a workout, you're inflamed. If you don't feel after a workout, you feel good, that doesn't mean you're not inflamed. I know I hate to use a double negative, but
Mm-hmm.
it means you could still be inflamed, right?
Right.
But the key is dialing in all these little things that help create more factories, create more energy, and heal your body in
Mm-hmm.
between all of that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Exactly.
I have to tell you, whenever I talk to you about things, it just sounds so simple, right? And I know that for most people, it's not this simple, but yet it's like 1 + 1 = 2. It is that simple if we understand the algorithm,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So why do we have such a hard time with it?
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, I think that we have fallen into this trap of, oh my God, there's just so many answers to that question. But I think that when we pulled fat back in the 70s and the 80s and made fat the demon, and in its place, we replaced it with lots of carbohydrates and sugars and sugary things, and then more unhealthy fat substitutes that we didn't know were as unhealthy as we now recognize that they are, the margarines and the polyunsaturated fats, the unhealthy types. So we created this taste desire that has made it so we have changed our natural appreciation for the benefits of healthy foods. And I'm kind of talking around it, but I know you know what I'm talking about, because when you choose to change how you're fueling your body, it doesn't take very long. Like when you cut way back on sugar and you're eating that variety of colorful things, that your body starts to tell you, that's what I want. And when you look at those things, that's what makes your mouth water. And when you look at things, common commercials, let's say, that are, dripping with fatty things, it's not appealing to you anymore. Whereas when you were eating those things, it was really appealing. It's like an addiction. So it's really appealing and you're drawn to it and you want it. So when I want that, I want to try that. But once your body is taken away from that distorted perception, then you no longer have a desire for that. So I think we still are promoting that in our advertising, in our culture, that hedonistic food, eating stuff that's bad for us, that it's an indulgence instead of a poison, which is the reality.
Yes, that changes. So for me, that changes everything. Like even working with patients, it changes everything. When you take away that sinful element, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
alluring to think, oh, should I do that? Should I eat that chocolate cake? When you change that to say, should I eat that poison? It literally changes your perspective on things. And I totally agree with you. I know most people find that it's so hard to believe that right
Mm-hmm.
now you're on this cycle of crashing and craving, right? Your blood sugar's crashing, you need to eat something, you reach for a cookie or a granola bar, then you spike your blood sugar, then it starts to crash again and you reach for something else, whether it's some Hershey Kisses or whatever. When you get stuck on that roller coaster,
Yes.
you're craving unhealthy things. You're craving more sugar, you're craving more fat. And I want to demonize the food industry because they're a big part of this. There is a perfect
Mm-hmm.
algorithm, a ratio of sugar to fat to salt that they wired. And if you look at virtually anything on the shelves that's packaged, it matches that ratio, whether it's
Yep.
a cracker or a candy bar. Believe it or not, they all kind of look the same nutritionally when you look at the ratio of sugar to fat to salt. And we
Mm-hmm.
learned, David Kessler wrote a great book on that. But we know that we are wired to be addicted to that.
Mm-hmm.
But the light at the tunnel is exactly what you said. When people start shifting away from that and start eating the rainbow and eating closer to the earth and natural foods, you start to crave that. And
Yes.
those cravings are cravings of minerals and vitamins and every nutrients your body needs to do good, to heal, to meet the demand of what you're doing, to build more factories for more energy, to
Yeah.
build more muscle, all of that.
So I think one of the things that really pulls us into that trap when we're talking about the standard American diet and the composition that you just mentioned with the fat and the sugars and the salt is that promotes that state of insulin resistance that I alluded to earlier, where the body can't respond to the insulin signal to take the glucose, the fuel, into the cell for that to be used kind of like the gasoline to generate the energy, to generate the ATP. So the cell feels relatively starved. And so it sends a signal back to the brain saying, I need more fuel. That's why in just a couple of hours, you're feeling you're looking for the chips, you're looking for the handful of Hershey's Kisses. You feel like you need something because you can't utilize those empty calories the same way that you can when they're brought in a more nutritious way with the balance of fiber and the slower absorption of glucose and the proper insulin signaling. So all of that change in your physiology just creates more of that vicious cycle of craving for sugar, craving for sweet things, craving for, the fatty things that are also have a lot of carbs. Like I'm thinking like, a drippy burger, which sometimes I'm not going to lie, I like that. but it's few and far between, not the staple. So it's not what drives the way my physiology works. It's that 80-20 rule where
Yes.
I'm not going to completely avoid all of those things, but I'm going to make it a rare thing that comes in so that it's not what sets the tone.
That's oh my gosh, so correct. And the other part of it is when we talk about insulin resistance, I think people think, "Oh, I have my blood checked with my doctor. I don't have that
Yes.
problem." And the reality is insulin resistance is a decade-long development that flies under the radar of your doctor for the most part, most doctors. I know in your
Absolutely.
practice, you're on top of it. I laughed. I interviewed Dr. Gina Pritchard a little while ago, and we talked about this. That how ironic that insulin is the hormone that is so impactful, yet so few doctors actually check insulin.
Mm-hmm.
We spend all of our time looking at glucose, and if your body's good at mopping it up as a mess, it doesn't mean there aren't issues there.
Right. Well, like we talked about earlier with the exercise compensation, our bodies are designed to compensate for what we throw at them. And so, for a long time, your body will try to compensate for these abnormalities in your glucose regulation and keep the blood sugar, the glucose, normal or not let it get terribly high where it's diagnostic of diabetes. But the process, that abnormal process in the compensation where your insulin level is getting higher and higher and higher, it's really not uncommon for me to see either a normal or just a modestly elevated fasting blood sugar and a sky high insulin level of 20 or 23 when it should be 5.
Right, right. That's exactly
Mm-hmm.
right. And so most doctors don't do that. That's not considered a
Mm-hmm.
standard of care test to look at insulin. And so you could be flying under the radar with insulin resistance. And it is, if I don't tell me if you agree, but to me, it is one of the hallmarks of constant weight gain despite what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things that's usually in the background when a woman is working out and trying to eat right and doing the right things and nothing's changing in her physiology or she's continuing to gain weight. You know, all the hormones, thyroid, things like that, but
Mm-hmm.
insulin is often in there.
Absolutely true, because when you can't get that glucose, that blood sugar into the cell to use it as fuel, what does your body have to do with it? It has to stuff it somewhere, just like what you have to do if your mother-in-law is suddenly coming over and the house is a mess, right? You're shoving it everywhere. You're sticking it under the carpet, in the closet, you know, under the couch, whatever, wherever you can put it. And your body does the same thing with glucose. If it can't utilize it the way it needs to be utilized, then it's stuffing it in other places. And one of that is the generation of fat and free fatty acids. So
Yep.
yeah, it is.
So
And then
another
you get
good
that.
reason to exercise,
Mm-hmm.
another good reason to burn it off, get rid of it, right? Use it as fuel.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Love it. So if we have to summarize, I think the big takeaways here are it's not just wrinkles, crow's feet, marionette lines that are the hallmark of aging. Inflammation is the hallmark of aging. And it's either inflammation that you know is there, or most often it's inflammation that you don't know is there. And that
Absolutely
kicks
true.
off this vicious cycle that leads to muscle loss, that leads to collagen loss, that leads to hormones declining. All of those things are affected by the way we eat, sleep, move, all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're amazing. Just
Oh, thank
amazing. I hope everyone sees what a ninja Dr. Burke is. So you can find Dr. Burke. She lives in El Dorado Hills, California. Absolutely beautiful, golden land. Um,
you.
the name of her practice is the True Health Center for Functional Medicine. True Health Center for Functional Medicine, El Dorado Hills, Dr. Kristine Burke. You will see her many times. We have so many things to talk about and bring you. So we'd love to hear your feedback, your questions, anything you'd like to hear about next. We'd love to address your topics and get deep on these things. And I know that you can tell we share a passion for living ageless. And that's what this whole podcast is about. We are evolving. We are in the process of changing one thing at a time. And if there's one thing you've learned here today that you can start to implement to live ageless, you're on your way. Kristine, thank you so much for joining me today. You're amazing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Michelle. The feeling is mutual.
All right, everyone. Have a wonderful week and keep on living ageless. Bye now.
Live, live